All right, if you would, open up to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. I know we've already covered the first 4 verses of chapter 18, but because time was running out so quickly on us last time around, I wanted to kind of take an extra moment and kind of introduce Corinth. Of course, as we're preaching through 1 Corinthians on Sunday mornings, just to see what these saints in Corinth were dealing with in 1 Corinthians. Of course, the congregation that is talked to of the saints in the book of 1 Corinthians has not yet fully blossomed, whenever we're reading it here in Acts chapter 18, but it's out of these things that body is going to grow from. What comes to mind when you just think of the city of Corinth? Anything? Problems. She's already in 1 Corinthians. Just the city of Corinth.
Oh, I was
just touching my face, you know. So you start going through and realize Corinth is a port city, so it's right there on the water. It is such a town of pagan gods and idols. If you remember, where has Paul just been before he comes to Corinth? He's been at Mars Hill in Athens, and you think about these gods to everything, even including an unknown God that Paul proclaimed to them. You step into Corinth, and there are so many temples to these Roman and Greek gods in Corinth that's just part of their culture. It is so ingrained within them whether they follow it or not. Of course, all these myths just made up stories by man. But when you come to Corinth, it's about 45 miles from Athens, a little bit less than that. And to come there, realize that's quite a journey to travel by foot or even in other ways at that time. Poseidon, big temple to Poseidon there, or Neptune, the Greek god of the sea, which of course all made up. So you understand, whenever the mariners would come into port, if they had a safe journey, who are they going to go offer up to? They're going to go offer up a sacrifice to Poseidon or Neptune. He says, even in terms of other things that are there, the temple to the goddess of Aphrodite or Venus. Of course, she's considered to be the goddess of love, beauty, even fertility. And you get a bunch of these mariners who come into port, they're pretty excited to go thank Neptune for all their safety and then go meet some nice young lady over at the temple to Aphrodite who goes after beauty. And you realize this is just a system that just feeds off of itself, just over and over again. And then you think of, there's even a Roman goddess by the name of Fortuna. Can you guess what that's about? Can you hear the English word in there? Fortune. Oh, give us fortune on our next trip as we go. You can understand. These are all things that are just layered on top of each other. It's not just one little thing. And this is the town of Corinth. There's a temple to each one of these gods in the city of Corinth, or right outside of it. Then in terms of Hermes or Mercury, you probably think about the god of Roman or Greek in terms of Mercury. We're going, a god even just to merchants and travelers. So even if you're just going to go on a trip, this is where you would go. Think about what do you do before you leave on a journey? Do you ever pray to God? Pray for a safe trip. Pray for the Lord to use you in some way for His benefit. And to realize they took those same sentiments, but instead of going to the true God, they're going to all these pagan gods that are right there in their midst, or their temples and everything else. And just in case, there's even a goddess named Isis, another temple that's there, and she's the goddess of healing. And you think, and even magic. And just in case that wasn't enough, there's a pantheon there, basically, which is to all the gods. So you realize Paul got a step into Athens, and he kind of got a little bit of an introduction into where he was going to be at whenever he came down to Corinth. Because Athens was kind of small compared to Corinth in terms of the way all these things were blown up. Now, real quickly, Acts chapter 18, verse 1. So just so you kind of understand the environment that we're talking about in the midst of. Because they have all these made-up tales and stories compared to the true God that created all of heaven and earth and the sea. So 18:1 says, after these things, he, Paul, left Athens, went to Corinth. He found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, who of course is Caesar, had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So Paul runs into these two Jewish Christians named Aquila and Priscilla, and you realize they've been pushed out along with all the Jews, not just Jewish Christians, but all the Jews out of Rome by the Roman Caesar Claudius. And this is probably around the dates of like 48 to 52 AD, whenever Claudius makes this decree. And so in these things kind of going together, you look at it and you go, nothing like having to leave, and keep in mind, Rome is several hundred miles away and across the sea. And so here they are, they come to a new place. Paul's here, this is a new place to him, and then all of a sudden, here's kind of those who are transplants intersect each other, and they find out that they have the same trade and they're tent makers. And so, after you made a long journey, especially back then, you don't have a whole lot of money left, so you better get to work. Then, of course, verse 3, or the end of 2, he came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. Verse 4, and he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now notice this, in the midst of making tents during the week, all of a sudden the Sabbath comes, where are you going to find Paul? He's going to be in the synagogue. And realize it's kind of handy, because even with Aquila and Priscilla, they're Jews as well. Now they're Christians or saints. And so all of a sudden, it's kind of nice to have some people also go to the synagogue with you that you know share the same faith in Jesus. And so every Sabbath, this is where you find Paul. And if you notice kind of the specific aspect of this, it's going to tell you here in a minute exactly what he was preaching while he was there. But look at verse 5. He says, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, do you remember Silas and Timothy? I mean, this has kind of been a package through time here. If you look back at chapter 17, just look at verses 14 and 15. If you remember, Paul and Silas and Timothy are there in Berea, and where the noble Jews are, and they actually study the Scriptures daily, and sure enough, when you find it, you study the Scriptures daily, you're going to come to some faith, because that's what's laid out here. You're going to look at what God says, you're going to see that He's kept His promises, and you go, this is the direction we should go. As part of that, if you remember, those hostile Jews from Thessalonica come down, and they stir up the crowd, and Paul heads down to Athens, but Silas and Timothy stay there. And they kind of, if you notice, this is verses 14 and 15 of Acts 17, 14 and 15. He says, then immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remained there. Now those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come down to him as soon as possible, they left. There's apparently some group that comes down with Paul to Athens. And then Paul sends a message back with them, that little group. He says, you go back and you tell Silas and Timothy to come down to me as soon as possible. And so then you get this story that takes place, we read in chapter 17, about Paul in Athens and teaching them about the gospel. And then Paul leaves Athens and comes down to Corinth. Well now, apparently, what does this tell you about Silas and Timothy? They're obedient, right? Paul sends this message back by those that came with him that went back to Berea and says, hey, just tell Silas and Timothy to come down as soon as they can. Sure enough, Timothy and Silas do. They come down. And you think, out of all the things that you could do, all the places that you've been, I mean, think about being in Berea with a bunch of people who want to study Scripture. You go, man, this is a great place to be. And you want us to come down to Corinth, huh? And so you realize, how easy would it be to say, I'd rather stay here? See how easy that would be? I mean, typically whenever things are, we might use the word comfortable, people have a desire for Scripture, and to go, no, you need to leave there. You need to go down here to a place with all these pagan temples and all these pagan gods. Which one would you rather be at? Which one would you choose if you had not been given a command? You think you'd stay with the Bereans? I think that's where I'd want to be. But you notice, Timothy and Silas go, you know what, if that's what Paul says we should do, we better go down to him. And so sure enough, here in Acts chapter 18, verse 5, it says that when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, which that's where Berea is in Thessalonica, he says, Paul began devoting himself completely to the Word. What does that mean? Just think about these verses that we've read. What does that translate into when Paul says he dedicated himself completely to the Word?
Did he just start preaching and give up his tent making?
Yeah. He's going, you know what? Whenever I came here, he says, before Silas and Timothy show up, we're just working and making tents. Yeah. Every Sabbath he's going into the synagogue. But now that Silas and Timothy show up, he says, now I'm going to be completely devoted to the Word. In other words, he's not going to be making tents every day anymore. It doesn't mean he's not going to make them at all. But you think about, hey, completely devoted to the Word. Typically, whenever we hear that kind of statement about completely devoted to the Word, we think about, oh, okay, now we're really going to try to live godly. Is that what changed with Paul? Certainly not. Certainly not. So we have to kind of be careful when we use these phrases and hear them. But he's going, you know what? I'm going to lay these other things aside. Now think about what that means. I'm not going to have this income anymore. What's it like when somebody goes, you know what? I'm not going to do my normal job anymore? What is Paul trusting in? He's trusting that God's going to take care of him. Now, he might have very well had some money stored up from all the time he'd been making tents with Aquila and Priscilla. But to see these decisions that have to be made and going, this is what these people need, and I'm willing to trust the Lord to do it. Do you see the faith response in that? Now, he says, Paul began devoting himself completely to the Word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. What is his point with the Jews? If you had to boil it all down to just one major bullet point.
He's trying to convince them that Christ is the Messiah that they've been waiting for.
That Jesus is this Messiah that all these prophecies of the Old Testament are about. Now, it doesn't lay out some big, long, teaching of Paul here, because he's already really done these same basic things already through the book of Acts. But if you think about it, just kind of imagine it for a moment. If you were called to go in and to teach Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, what kind of things, how would you go about that? You don't have any of the New Testament. How are you going to have to go about this? Scripture, Old Testament, prophecies, and to go, here you are in the synagogue. In order to have a synagogue, you had to have copies of what? Old Testament. The Torah specifically of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but typically the rest as well that we know of is our Old Testament. And to go, even Moses talked about there's going to be a prophet who's going to be like me. You're going to have to heed every word that he says. And to go, if you were a Jew, wouldn't you want to know who that prophet was? That's going to lead you right to Jesus. If you think about all these sacrifices in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, about who's going to be the fulfillment of all those sacrifices. Jesus is. And you go, and he's going to die for your sin. You start working your way through about God's promises, even through the book of Deuteronomy, leading them into Joshua to take over the promised land. Who's going to fulfill and take care of them back there? God was. Who's going to take care of you now? Jesus will. But you're going to have to respond out of faith. You have to respond in this way, which is kind of unique because everything is about Jesus is the Christ. I want you to, this may be an embarrassment a little bit. When's the last time you heard a lesson on Jesus is Christ?
A few weeks ago.
Good.
Actually, it's every sermon. Well, but yeah. But exclusively, we had a lesson on Messiah, who he really was.
All right. And whenever you're going to have a lesson like that, where do you have to go? Church. You're going to have to go to the Old Testament, right? So you realize so often we want to read just the New Testament. And I understand that to a point. How much do we still need the Old? It's written there for our learning. I mean, even Romans 15 talks about that. And to go, you see, here's what God promised, and then you come to the New Testament to find what about Jesus? He's the fulfillment of those things, right? So, whenever you see this statement here at the end of 5, he says, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. He says, you need to know that's who he is. And of course, how many hundreds of prophecies are in the Old Testament about Jesus, the Messiah? Then, look at verse 6. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. Notice what is the Jewish response in general. There's some exceptions to this, but in general, what's their response to Jesus as the Messiah? Rejection, right? It uses the word here, it says resisted. That's about a hostility. Blasphemed is really about to slander. It's that all of a sudden they go around and start saying all these slanderous things about Paul, let alone blaspheming against God. But he says they resisted and blasphemed. And what's Paul's response to all this? He says, I'm going to shake the dust off my feet, which is exactly what Jesus told the original 12 apostles. This is what you should do. If you can kind of think back in your head to Matthew 10:14, whenever Jesus is talking to his 12 before they get sent out on their own for a little while. And he says, whoever does not receive you, he says, nor heed your words as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. He says, whoever doesn't receive you and doesn't heed your words. What was going on with some of these Jews in Corinth? They weren't receiving Paul. They're slandering him. There's the blasphemy. He says, and they're not heeding his word. They're resisting the word. So it's exactly, idea for idea. And so Paul's response is, well, we just got to try harder. How often is that our response? Someone resists what God desires. They even slander us, and we go, we're just not trying hard enough. What's the real thing that's going on? We're just not listening to Jesus. Because what did Jesus tell them to do? He says, shake the dust. He says, there's other opportunities. Spend time with somebody else. Now,
And he just warned them, the blood's going to be on their own head.
right, and then you get this statement, and if you notice, it says, he shook out his garments and said to them, and you think about him shaking them off, and to these Jews, this is not like, oh, this is some kind of secret message that only he and God know about. It's like, they realize what this is. And maybe it made an impression on somebody. And he says, your blood be on your own heads. Now, what does that really mean? Have you ever heard in the Old Testament a term of blood guiltiness? What do you hear in that? Whenever you see that phrase or read that phrase, what do you draw from that? Death? You've made your own decision, and now you're going to have to live with it. He says, you are guilty of blood. Oh, we would say, your blood's on your own head. This is not the same phrase as you shot yourself in the foot, because you can still get around and live. He says, whenever your blood's on your head, he says, you're destined to die. This is the same kind of terminology you get from Deuteronomy all over the place, which is interesting to me because it makes me wonder, did Paul bring up some of these things, even in trying to teach them about Jesus the Messiah? But to go, you know what, you made this decision to go against God, to resist Him, and to blaspheme and even slander Paul, and you go, you're spiritually dead, and you're not doing anything about it. Now, how many times in life do you see people who are spiritually dead, and they've accepted that, and they're not going to move off of it? They're even hostile towards somebody who brings up anything spiritually minded about Jesus. And typically, what's our response? What do we want to do? We want to try harder. Here's Jesus saying to His apostles, that's whenever you hand them over to the Lord. Until there's a heart change. Until the hostility goes away. Until the blasphemy or the slander goes away. Because if the heart's not there, I want you to notice what's going on. Look back at the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 15. Because let me show you what's at hand. Matthew chapter 15. I want you to look at verses 15 through 20. Jesus has just come face to face with talking to these religious leaders, and He says, you know, with your words you praise me. He says, but you say it all in vain. He says, in vain do you worship me. He says, and you have your own teachings that you put forward as the doctrines of God, but they're really just yours. Is that exactly where the Jews in Corinth were? They were not going to come under the reign of Jesus. They had made up their own rules. Yeah, we're right and you're wrong. Notice as you continue in verse 14, Jesus says, let them alone. He says, they are blind guides of the blind, and if the blind man guides the blind man, both will fall into a pit. What does Jesus say about them? Let them be. Leave them alone. They're blind guides of the blind. Think about it. Here's these religious leaders, Jewish religious leaders. He says, don't go straighten them out. He says, just leave them alone. Then, verse 15, Peter said to him, explain the parable to us. Like, help us out a little bit. Which tells you, if this is the first time you ever heard that, you go, well, what's he talking about? Verse 16, Jesus said, are you still lacking in understanding also? Oh. What's the answer to that question? Yes. Are we ever lacking in understanding? Yes. So humbly come before Jesus. He says, do you not understand that everything that goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is eliminated? I'm sure they were thinking, he's going to talk to us about a digestive tract? What's this got to do with anything? But then he's going to bring it together. Verse 18. But the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile the man. What's the real problem with the Jewish leaders? Heart. What's the problem with the Jews in Corinth that are in the synagogue who are blaspheming and resisting or hostile toward Jesus as the Messiah? Heart. Notice how it continues. Verse 19. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, and slanders. Now, the Greek word for slander, blasphemous. That's where that word comes from. It's really just a transliterated word. That's why people hear blasphemy and they go, what does that really mean? It's amazing when translators don't really know what to put and they don't want to cause a stir, they just transliterate the word and go, you deal with it. It's the same thing that they did with baptism. They said, if we write what it really means, then we're going to get our heads cut off by the king. So we'll just leave it as baptism. Sometimes that's just what happens. But you realize this, verse 20. He says, these are the things which defile the man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile the man, which was the original question they put up. Here's what we really need to see. When you see people resist Jesus, and even they start to slander against others, to blaspheme, what's the real problem? Heart. Sometimes we get ourselves in a lot of trouble, and it's not because of standing up for Jesus. Because if we were really going to listen to Jesus, what would be the response? When you have somebody who is hostile and they're slanderous toward you in trying to teach them about Jesus, you go, it's a heart problem. Can we realize that? And to go, now, what if you get another opportunity with that individual, but now their heart has turned to go, I'm ready to listen. Is that a different scenario? Yes. Now, you look at this, and sometimes we go, you know what? They don't believe in Jesus, so I'm just going to give it to them. Don't be a fool. Think about Jesus. This is Matthew chapter 7, Sermon on the Mount, very beginnings of things. He says, don't cast your pearls before swine. Don't give what's holy to the dogs. And right before that, you know what he's been talking about in Matthew 7? It's the parable of the man with a speck in his eye and another man with a log in his eye. Whenever you find people who are hostile or resistant toward the Word of God, you'll find they want to pick out every speck in your life. But what are they not willing to recognize? Their own log. Their own log. In other words, when Jesus brings that up, he's making a statement of, if they're not willing to examine themselves, he says, don't throw what's holy to the dogs. He says, because it's only going to get worse. He says, or else they'll turn and they'll tear you. So often we neglect to really take that in. Now here's the thing. Does that mean that Jesus doesn't love these people? No. But Jesus says, you can't work against stone. He says the hearts are hard. Now if the heart softens up, now here's an opportunity. Because you can have the same person. I hope you've had this experience in life. A person maybe that you knew some measure of years ago, and they were so resistant to the gospel. They were hostile. They always told you how you did things wrong in your life, and yet they were never willing to look at themselves. And then all of a sudden, these difficulties come in their life, and they realize, you know what? You still got stability. What do I need to do? Now that's a different question, isn't it? And you realize, now we have a heart that's ready to receive. And you don't tell them, well, here's why you were wrong. What's it time to show them? Jesus is the Christ. And he's the one we should submit to. And so often, this is the patience that's talked about in love. Judy. It's so hard.
Yeah, it's too hard.
Hard by the path, that soil. And you think about that too. Jesus tells that parable. He doesn't say, all right, well, go out and till the hard soil and then plant the seed. He says, throw the seed. He says, if it's not received, the birds are going to take it and they'll take it away. Going to do nothing with it. And you realize, look for the soil that actually has a chance. He throws the seed on the hard soil, but he doesn't continue to do all the work right there because there's other soils that need just as much attention. Carla.
I think too, there's a message here for me and Paul that he's saying, I'm done with the Jews and arguing here, but he didn't just throw up his hands and quit. He said,
Right.
I'm going to the Gentiles.
Right.
I mean, he's in a Gentile area.
Right.
Corinth is very Gentile. You know, it was the few Jews that were there. But
Right.
I think too oftentimes we really get discouraged and just say, okay, I'm done.
Right. And to realize he doesn't give up at all. He keeps on plugging along. But now it's like, okay, well, this soil is hard. Let's go to some more fertile soil. Judy, you have something else to add there?
I was just going to say, in thinking about the parable of the sower, what I see today in the world is just that seed is getting choked out by so many worldly things that's coming to the church, that's
Right.
coming to our lives, and it's a real concern just to know, see the seed just be taken over by.
Right. And you see it choked out by the worries of the world and deceitfulness of riches and all those kind of things. Coming back over to Acts chapter 18. So you see the heart being the problem. And to have enough discretion to go, you know what, this is a heart problem. And it's time for me to just move on to somewhere else for a while. If that heart changes, hey, take advantage of the opportunity. But don't keep running into a brick wall and think that you're doing it for Jesus. Because if we listened to him, we'd go, you know what, I don't have to run into that brick wall anymore. Let's go look for an opportunity that's open. Now, look at what Paul does. He says in verse 6, Acts 18:6, he says, but when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook off his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads, I am clean. Hey, I did what I was called to do. I was called to preach. I wasn't called to baptize. I was called to preach. I did my part. He says, from now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Well, how do you think the Jews felt about that? I don't know if you've noticed this yet in the book of Acts. Whenever Paul or somebody else says, we're going to the Gentiles, it's like, man, that just causes the Jews' blood to boil. I mean, it just goes rampant. Then, verse 7. Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. He says, I'll go next door. Now, he just says it's near. It doesn't say next door. But anyway, he says, here's Titus or Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. And you go, oh, can you worship God here? And go, let's be receptive. Verse 8, he says, Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household. This is the leader of the synagogue. So are some people being affected by the gospel? Yes. Even Crispus, he goes, man, he's right. And the leader of the synagogue was kind of like the one who, we would probably call him an organizer in one sense. He would pick the people who would come up and read, pick the people who would lead the prayers, do those kind of things. So he was somewhat of authority. And yet to go, he believes in the Lord. Do you notice the way it talks about it? It doesn't just say he believes. He doesn't just see Jesus as the Messiah. He sees Jesus as the one to submit to. He's the Lord. That means I am the servant or slave. Wow. Do you see the difference of heart? Many of the Jews in that synagogue were saying, we're hostile and we resist this teaching of Jesus as the Messiah. And then you have Crispus. I want you to think about this. As the leader, he's a guy who typically would be respected in some sense. And then you see the leader of the synagogue put his belief in the Lord. And it affects all of Crispus's household. If you remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul, whenever he starts writing in chapter 1, he says, I'm thankful I didn't baptize any of you, except Crispus and Gaius and perhaps the household of Stephanus. Crispus is the exception. So it's pretty slow coming at the very beginning. Then he says, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And notice, this is going to sound like dumb English for a second, but what does the word and mean? Conjunction. In other words, it's things that go together, right? Notice, does faith have to be present or belief have to be present in baptism? Yeah, it's worthless without it. And the way he talks about it, you see, they're working together as a unit. Faith in what baptism really was. Baptism was about saying, you know what? Jesus is Lord. Jesus is the Messiah. And yet, really to make sure, that's what I was saying when I was baptized. I'm not going to live my life according to me anymore. Think about Silas and Timothy. It'd been a whole lot easier to stay up there with the Berean Christians. But instead, I'm going to listen to my leader, my Lord. And here's Paul saying, look, this is what Jesus wants for us. Come down and meet me. Come down to pagan headquarters. That's what Corinth was. Hey, Jesus is Lord. Let's go. Now, notice how it continues even further. Verse 9. Kind of look at verses 9 and 10 together. He says, and the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. I want you to notice the timing of when the Lord sends this vision. When would you have wanted to know this message? Like maybe verse 1, right? When you left Athens to go down to Corinth, that would have been a great time for this vision. Whenever you had been making tents and you were deciding, is it time to stop making tents and really be devoted to preaching the Word? Wouldn't that be a great time for that vision in your mind? Oh, yeah. Do you notice when God gives it? Yeah. He says, whenever fear comes in, when he's already stepped out in faith. Now, let's just talk about this in general for a second. We want reassurance typically before we ever begin, right? Is that the way God works? He says, no. How about you respond out of faith and step out and go according to my word, and then I'll give you reassurance. Why do we expect it the other way around? What is God trying to refine and grow within us? Faith. He says, if I don't let you step out on faith to start, it won't be grown in you. You'll have to trust me first. Don't worry. I'll give the reassurance. I'll give the even more focused detail. But there's got to be a stepping out in faith to honor the Lord, no matter what the idea or situation at hand is. Then, look over at 1 Corinthians real quickly. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Just look at verses 3, 4, and 5. I want you to see this is what was going on inside of Paul whenever he came to Corinth. It doesn't give you these details in Acts, but Paul tells you himself here over in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, look at verse 3. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. What was going on inside of Paul? He's scared. You ever have moments like that? Things are going on and you go, oh man. He says, I'm weak. I'm afraid. And I'm even trembling. What did Paul do with that? You already know from what we've read. What did he do with it? What did he let reign? His fears or the Lord? The Lord.
Went ahead and teach it even though he was scared and didn't feel that strong.
Yeah, go ahead and teach. Go ahead and do what's right. Go ahead and do what honors the Lord. So many times we let the fears and the anxieties and the tremblings, and we let them reign over what we do. What does that do to faith? It just squelches it out, just like those thorns that are in the soil. It says fears, anxieties, worries. He says, they just do that to you. Paul says, you know what? I am weak. I'm afraid, and I'm trembling. But I'm going to do it anyway, because it's right. Is that the way we respond with fear? Whenever we know, look, this is what the Lord wants me to do, but I'm afraid. We're going to let the worries reign over us? Because faith isn't going to grow that way. You've got to trust and go ahead and do what's right. Notice verse 4. He says, and my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom. I wasn't cute and clever with what I said. He says, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. He says, here is what I put forward. And then verse 5. He says, and here's why I did it that way. He says, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. He says, we are so gullible for cleverness. Are we not? When things are cutesy, and he says, I didn't bring that to you. I brought you Jesus. He says, I told you about him and him crucified. He says, and they go, are you going to trust him? Because whenever you trust him, you know what he gives you then? Here comes power and strength. This is why all of a sudden the fears and the anxieties and the worries and the tremblings, we go, how come those don't go away? How come we're not stepping out in faith? Because what will that do with all those things? It'll take them captive. And we'll overcome because of his power. So often we want reassurance before we begin. He says, nope, my reassurance comes after you step out in faith. Because that's where faith is grown. Isn't it interesting? Paul was preaching to them the exact same thing that he was going through. Man, we live in the midst of a pagan world. My own family's going to hate me. Or, man, my friends are going to never talk to me again. We're going to be isolated. We're going to be alone. What's controlling you? Fear. Yeah, but Jesus is Lord. Is he Lord over us? Janet?
And Paul was also always encouraging Timothy, who was timid.
Right.
And shy about things, and he knew where he was at. He understood what he was going through.
He knew the weakness. Janet brings up Timothy. He says, to bring and to develop Timothy, and even Silas and even Titus later on, of going, you know what, this is what weakness needs. It needs to see what the Lord wants and to step out in faith. Now come back over to Acts chapter 18. So, sure enough, the Lord said to Paul, don't be afraid any longer. He says, let go of it. Go on speaking. Don't be silent. He says, tell him. He says, because I am with you. Oh. Did Paul not realize that Jesus was with him anyway? Sometimes we just need that reassurance, don't we? If we're walking in the ways of Jesus, what should we recognize? We're with him, right? And he's with us. Then, he says, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. How's that for a promise? Now think about what he had just been through in the last few cities. I mean, how did it go in Thessalonica? Not well. How did it go in Berea whenever those hostile Jews showed up from Thessalonica down there? Not well. And to get to a place in Athens and go, okay, he gets to teach there, but on a minimal basis. And then you come to Corinth, and you go, man, this could blow up any minute. Fear, trembling. And then now you see Jesus go, no one's going to harm you here. And when Jesus makes a promise, what should it bring about within us? Peace, faith. Then, if you notice down in verse 11, he says, and he settled there 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. How long does he stay? 18 months. That's a pretty good length of time, especially whenever Paul's been in places like, he was there for a few Sabbaths. And now to go, no, this is where we need to be. Can you imagine being Crispus? Imagine being Gaius or household of Stephanus and going, you get to be there, right there with Paul he's there every week for 18 months. Talk about an opportunity, right? Now, here's what's unique. How often can you interact with Paul and Jesus? Opportunities there every day, isn't it? Now, notice how he continues. How much do we continue? All right, let's continue. Verse 12. So he's there, and notice what his point is. He's teaching the Word of God. And now this is the Gentiles, specifically. Here he is. He's already been told, and this is around AD 51 or 52 is the real peg point for timing on this one because of this next statement in verse 12. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, proconsul is kind of like a Roman governor of Achaia, he says, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. Well, how long did this take? And you go, man, it's been 18 months. Been pretty good stay. But still, once again, who's he still having to battle with? The Jews. My goodness. And then kind of notice, this is toward the end of that 18 months. Because you'll see as it unfolds if you don't already know it. And Gallio, the reason you know AD 51 or 52 is there was actually an inscription on in a city called Delphi, which is not very far away from here, that actually gives a specific timing for Gallio as proconsul. No, it doesn't say 51 or 52 AD, because they don't recognize things by Jesus. The year of our Lord, they're not seeing that yet, but it makes it easy to know. Then verse 13, he says, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. What law are they talking about? You're going to notice here in a minute, it's going to be about the law of Moses. You'd expect them to maybe be thinking along the lines of, he's a Roman proconsul, what's he going to care about? Let's talk about Roman law, because isn't that what they did with Jesus? Remember Luke 23? Whenever the Jews brought Jesus before Pilate, they says, you know what? He deceives the nation. He tells people not to pay their taxes. In other words, to pay your salary. He says, and he also says that this Jesus is king. He's king of the Jews. That he's going to supersede and take over Caesar's place and your place. Really trying to get the Romans going. You realize, interesting. Here these people are hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem. How's the Jewish thinking when they rebel against God? Still the same. Same old thing. So here's what they say. The man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law, verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, what was Paul going to do? He's probably about to teach the Word of God. But notice, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, he says, look after yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters. Paul get an opportunity? No. Are there times where God shuts down opportunities and uses men to do it? Even ungodly men like Gallio. You'll see how ungodly he is here in a second. Sometimes we got to, hey, are you supposed to subject yourself to governing authorities? You're going to notice Paul's not going to give some great big old speech after Gallio says, all right, this is dismissed. So often we just want to push right on through and go, you know what, this is for Jesus. Look Look at what Paul does. Then, verse 16, says he drove them away from the judgment seat, he being Gallio. Probably not personally. He probably had guards to do that. But anyway, verse 17. And they all took hold of Sosthenes. Who's they? These rebellious Jews. He says they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. Oh, guess what? After 18 months, is there a new leader of the synagogue? It's not Christmas anymore. Apparently he's left those Jews behind too. Now here's Sosthenes, leader of the synagogue, and they began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Gallio care? He's like, what's that got to do with me? Now, I hope you recognize Sosthenes. If you remember whenever the book of 1 Corinthians opens up, this letter comes from Paul and Sosthenes, our brother. So apparently Sosthenes goes off with Paul whenever he leaves the town of Corinth, which is kind of unique, isn't it? Think, I can't even stay here anymore. Formerly the leader of the synagogue, and he says, I got to get out of town. They're so hostile. And he does come to faith because he is a brother in 1 Corinthians 1:1 and 2. So he says, but Gallio is not concerned about any of these things. So you get this picture, once again. Is Paul willing to submit to the governing authorities? Yeah. Even if it means he's not going to be given an opportunity here to teach before the proconsul and these rebellious Jews. Now I want you to see the hand of God in this. How do these rebellious, hostile Jews feel about Jesus as the Messiah? They blaspheme, they resist. If God would have allowed Gallio to grant permission to Paul, what do you think is going to happen with those hostile Jews? They're going to be even worse. And what had Jesus promised Paul? You won't be harmed. Did Jesus keep his promise? Yes. Did Paul have to, by faith, respond to say, you know what, I'm going to submit to governing authorities? Surprisingly enough, he's the one who writes that over in Romans chapter 13. Right? So you realize, that means, okay, no opportunity here. To recognize a closed door and to recognize the protection of God. To keep his promise. Then, verse 18. Paul having remained many days longer. Notice, he stays many days longer. It doesn't say he just stayed many months longer. So this is kind of that end of the 18-month time in Corinth. He says, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. And you realize, oh, they're leaving with him too. I mean, Priscilla and Aquila, they are travelers. I mean, they started off this story in Rome. Then they get sent away from Rome along with all the Jews, not just the Jewish Christians. But all the Jews get thrown out of Rome by Claudius Caesar. And they come over to Corinth, and now they've been with Paul for 18 months. And now Paul's leaving, and they go, you know what? I think it's time to go too. And they leave as well. We can make tents there just as well as we can make them here. Then, he says, in Centuria he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. If you want some vast illustration or description or teaching on that, go enjoy. I'm not going to give it to you. It's just what it says. He's keeping a vow and he had his hair cut. Don't look into it too much. You probably don't make vows when you cut your hair, do you? Maybe after it's done, you might go, I vow not to go to that hairdresser again. But that's just what it is. Verse 19. They came to Ephesus. Who's the they? Priscilla, Aquila, Paul, probably Sosthenes, maybe even Silas and... You talk about a pretty good group to hang with. I think I could travel like that. But at the same time, notice how it continues. He says, they came to Ephesus and he left them there. Oh, notice, Paul's going to keep on going, but others are going to stay there in Ephesus, specifically Aquila and Priscilla. He says, now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Just like, welcome to a new city. So let's go see if there's anybody of faith in the Jewish synagogue. They'll come to Jesus. Verse 20 says, when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. Did they want him to stay? Yeah.
The Jews or the group he was with?
I think it's those who responded. And so he says, they asked him to stay for a longer time, and maybe they could even be Aquila and Priscilla as well as Sosthenes and Titus, or Silas and Timothy. But notice he says he did not consent. Now think about it. You've just come out of a place that you know you're going to be protected for all the time you were there. You come to a new place. You come to Ephesus. And there's a whole problem there in Ephesus too, if you remember some stories that are coming in terms of the Greek goddess of Artemis. And as it comes up here, he says, but taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills. Who is he letting stand in control? God. He says, I've already been in Corinth for a year and a half. He says, now we've come here. They said, hey, why don't you stay here? I almost wonder if they didn't say, why don't we stay here like we stayed in Corinth? And yet to go, all right. He says, no, that's not what we need to do. He says, but if there's an opportunity down the road to come back to Ephesus, if the Lord wills, we'll do it. He says, if it's what he wants. He says, he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. What's in Caesarea already? The church. Real quickly. Acts chapter 8. Look at the last verse.
That was a long, long trip.
It is a long, long trip. Look at Acts chapter 8, look at verse 40. You probably know the story of Simon the sorcerer, Simon the magician. You probably know the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. I just want you to take a little note here. Acts 8:40. But Philip found himself at Azotus, which is also a city called Ashdod. As he passed through, he kept preaching the gospel to all the cities until he came to Caesarea. Later on in the book of Acts, we're going to find Philip with his 4 virgin daughters, and guess where they're still going to be? Caesarea. So no wonder whenever you come over here in Acts 18 to verse 22, it says, when he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church. I wonder why there's a church there. Because that's where Philip's preaching. And that's where people are coming to faith. That's where people are trusting the Lord and responding. So now Paul comes down, and later on in the book of Acts, Philip's actually going to invite Paul to stay at his own house. Even though Paul had been partially responsible for the stoning of one of Philip's best friends, Stephen. And you realize, how deep does forgiveness go? And how much faith does it take to show that kind of forgiveness? So you see what's at hand. He says, and then it says, and he went down to Antioch. And then the story is going to continue on at Ephesus with Aquila and Priscilla for a little ways. But we'll get into that next week. We'll close right there for today. Brent will be back in December to start teaching, and so he'll pick up right here in Acts chapter 18, verse 22. So, all right, have a good week.